Hello everyone, so very nice to be here. We have this impossible task of taking 5 minutes to talk about these very complex issues, but we'll try to do the best as we can. I'm president of Period Think Tank. It's a feminist think tank. Our main aim is to, let's say it works, it doesn't work, it works. Yes. So we want to promote gender equity through a feminist approach to data. And we are working both with public institutions in Italy, municipalities, regional government, national government, to advocate for more gender disaggregated data, because without gender disaggregated data we cannot monitor the gender impact of public policies. And we move this approach also to artificial intelligence. So we work on both sides, not just artificial intelligence, but also not big data. And so there are some key points that I want to underline in these presentations, even if they're very complex issues. So what we advocate for. So we want data sets that can include the intersectional approach. That's one of the most challenging things. You will see that we will take some of the issues that come up this morning. So it's interesting that I'm talking from a feminist activist point of view, but things that this morning Joanna and Ivana talked about, we will bring them up as well. And so we need intersectional data sets. To make you an example from data sets that even government institutions are using, some of them are not even binary. Can you even imagine? So we are not having all the gender representation. So if we add the intersectional point of view, when we should bring in all the things together, gender, ethnicity, class, and all the characteristics, they are missing. So that's one of the main points. But it's also because there is this huge problem that AI works with labels, characterization, standards, and gender in our lives are not. So that's why it's so difficult. The technology cannot just, it's not our lives and our current features are not static. But the technology needs static information, historical data. So the way it works, as we know this morning, again, it's working to keep the things as they are. And we have imbalanced structure of power, asymmetries of power among people in our societies. And so that's why it's so very difficult. So as Ivana said this morning, to promote equality, it's a choice, it's a political choice, but also, in my opinion, to keep using AI as it is, it's a political choice. So it's working to the system of power that we have, to the discrimination that we have. And so if we use it as it is, that's what we are going to keep seeing. It works for patriarchy, sexism, racism, and all the problems that we are seeing. So we want that underrepresented and marginalized individual communities can be part of the process from the real beginning. Not just validating at the end, but also be part of the designing process of AI. So the complete development, not just at the end of it. Because, as we're saying, biases and harms can really vary according to the context. So it's not fixed, something that can be valid to be fair for me, that I'm a white woman, cannot be the same for a woman from a different background that's living in my same country. There are different kind of levels. I'm privileged compared to her, but maybe I'm not privileged compared to a white man in my country, etc., etc. So that's why it's so complex, and we need to bring the users in a participatory methods and process all the time since the really beginning. Of course, this requires an extra effort for companies, from governments that wants to use it. So if we want a fair society, we need to really work hard for it, because outside AI, see, that's one of the things, is that we don't have fairness. We are living in an unfair world, unfortunately. So it's very complicated to make a fair world already, and the AI is just keep increasing and expanding the discrimination. So we need to both work on both sides at the same time, outside technology, with technology, so how AI can really help us in making the world as we want to see it, and hopefully more and more people want to have a better and fairer world that we are living in now. So that's why it's so important, you know, the lack of transparency that we are having for the training data set and algorithm, because especially from Italy, where I come from, people are not very aware of these topics because it's not clear where AI is used. It's still not used a lot. So there is not a consciousness, even from activists, that's something that we should really engage on and request immediate action, because action needs to be taken now. Maybe we're even late for the process. That's why I used to say, I put the title, you know, AI fairness, it's not keeping up with development, because the development is still so far ahead that our consciousness of the problem is really behind. So that's why we really need to bring more consciousness. And also ask for, that's one of the main points, because I think that the 5 minutes are running out, almost. That's why I think we also need to, one of the main points, have alliances and partnership within you know, activists, researchers, developers, because how do we bring about public opinion consciousness and action and politics and policymaker action if we make a fuss about it? I mean, the more action, the more discussion we make, the more there will be attention by it from policymakers and media, and people will get more you know, active about it. Because if there is no political interest in that, demand of action, they will not make it, because it's just so you know, challenging for the structure of power to question all of the things we are talking about that are absolutely political choices. So that's why here it is, you know, more partnership, more intersectional data set, but still we need to work for this even outside the AI system, because as I told you, if you're going to look at data sets that people are using outside AI, they're not fair. They're not intersectional, so that's why the work is so big. And to conclude, we need to, I would like to show you this quote, it's moving a little bit slowly. Okay, there it is. So that's our hope for the future, that all people deserve to build, test, be represented in, benefit from AI, and at the same time kept safe from its potential harms. That's what we want to achieve. Thank you very much.
Okay, 5 minutes, another Italian. Just a brief introduction about myself. I'm a philosopher of tech. So I'm working in Utrecht University, and I'm part of the intercultural digital ethics team of FINDHR, so one of the projects of today. And as a philosopher, in these 5 minutes, I want to give you just conceptual clarity about representational arms. So, why representational arms? You can find a concrete example. I'm going to start with a concrete example. This is Lensa AI, a mobile app used by one of the senior reporters of the MIT Technology Review years ago, and she found out that using this app that is based on an open source AI model, so stable diffusion, she found out that on the 100 images she received, just 16 of them were like super sexualized, were topless. So in a certain sense, she notices this kind of representational arm in the results. But while Lensa AI, with her colleagues, and I must say, mostly men, mostly white, they received basically, I don't know, astronauts, warriors. They received like cool singers perfect for, I don't know, indie albums cover. So most fairness research is focused right now on allocative arms. That means, disparities in accessing resources like loans, houses, a job that you can get lost. But representational arms is something completely different. They are less tangible, so you cannot really miss your representational arms. And most importantly, they are based on the social identity of people. So one question that I want to ask in this presentation is, why are such representations harmful? Well, there are two main reasons. The first is because these AI models can reflect, but not just reflect, also exacerbate deeply embedded problematic assumptions in society and simplify complex social constructs. So just to give you an example, we have a problematic assumption about the gender identity of people, because we base our idea of gender based on a binary classification that the most of the time does not include the active participation of subjects. So, and again, this is a way of simplification of the social imaginary. That's why I wanna say that also representational arms is, of course, are about capabilities of people. So the way we represent, the way we use epistemic framework. Epistemic framework means the way we interpret and navigate the world. So the way we use normative expectation, the way we use norms, the way we use social cultural norms between people. And these representational arms has an effect also on allocative arms. So just to give an example, again, researchers have found out that sentimental analysis systems can, like Amazon Comprehend, can give, on average, lower scores to queer women in comparison to queer men. And this can have an impact on the access of opportunities like, I don't know, personalized healthcare, just to give an example. And again, the UNESCO report that just was published like 2 weeks ago, so very recent, the UNESCO report found out that large language models, in a certain sense, when we tell them to write a story about people, the results were like completely discriminated against, like Zulu men, for example. So Zulu men were assigned jobs like gardener, while white men were assigned jobs like doctors. So we all know that there's a risk of representational arms. And discrimination is not only a matter of allocative arms, so distributive justice, but it's also a matter of epistemic injustice. And again, understanding fairness, slippery slope. We all talk about fairness. So algorithmic fairness not just relate to the equal distribution of outcomes, but of course to structural injustice, so the way we represent people. And so we need to find a way to talk about algorithmic harms in a more general way, not just trying to disentangle them because there's no clear distinction between them sometimes. And I want to talk about meaningful data. Well, we implement in FINDHR, for example, we trying to implement synthetic datasets from collected CV, and the Alan Turing report on synthetic data say this: synthetic data need to be meaningful. But what does it mean to be meaningful? They must be at the same time similar from the original data, so similar to the original data, but also different from original data. Because this match between original data and synthetic data can be undesirable, like for privacy reason, but also for bias reason. And again, we need to find a way to not just have descriptive, evaluation about world, so try to understand the statistical patterns of distributive justice in the world, but also to find a normative way to identify way in which datasets can be constructed. Because we can have an observable space in datasets, so just measure what is fair in the world right now, but in datasets we also have a constructed space, what we should measure. So our aim, like, I don't know, identify criminal patterns, identify discriminatory patterns, and this is a normative question. And one of the way, of course, can be implement responsiveness. This is one of the principles of responsible innovation. That means align with people values along the way as they emerge. So, thanks.
Okay, so I'm not going to try to go super in-depth in 5 minutes into some of my various activities, but I'll try to give a quick overview so that you can kind of at least know enough to ask me later. So I have a background in mathematics, and I'm one of the people in the tech part of the BIAS project. One of the main activities that we're sort of a starting point for the project is we're looking specifically at the use of natural language processing in recruitment tools, AI recruitment tools. And so we're starting by looking directly at the word embeddings and large language models that are used for that processing, and looking specifically at methods for bias detection and mitigation in those models. And this is sort of working towards this, as Roger mentioned before, this attempt to try to prototype an NLP and CBR-based recruitment tool that is trying to integrate principles of, say, alt-AI, trustworthiness, fairness, and to mitigate bias. And we sort of, that's one direction of the work I'm doing, and then the other direction is sort of closer collaboration, especially with the group in Leiden, with the law and philosophy of law, to kind of imagine designing tools in different ways from sort of what might be considered the standard in AI tool design. And we have different frameworks that we're kind of using for that, among them the concept of value-sensitive design, which I will explain a bit more later, and the concept of agonistic machine learning is another one that's piquing my interest lately. So if you're interested in either of those, we can also talk about that more. And what's important about both these directions is that we're doing this in this ecosystem of many partners from different disciplines in different countries. And for instance, in the bias detection and mitigation in language models, most of the existing research is very English-centric and focused on very general contexts. And we, together with the sort of co-creation workshops and our other partners, are really focused on broadening and sort of adjusting for very language and cultural specific biases, and specifically those relevant to hiring. And so the sort of main contribution there is to really focus in on this context and focus in on very specific cultural things that is sort of not existent in the current research, state of the current field. And yeah, so I think that's, and then one of the other activities we've been doing is these co-creation workshops where we've sort of tried to understand the values and needs of the important stakeholders when it comes to these recruitment tools. And we've sort of, which we got lucky that these huge developments in instruction following language models happened with this project, that we could sort of really quickly throw together mock tools and sort of bring them to these workshops and really have stakeholder groups play with them, try to input their own preferences and get their sort of feedback and sort of try to integrate that into our sort of future work. I'm also in a different project that I want to mention because it's quite complementary to the work in the bias project. And it's at the Zurich University of the Arts, and it's called Latent Spaces Performing Ambiguous Data, which is a bit of a, well, ambiguous sounding name. It's actually an arts-based research project, but it's funded by the Swiss Science Foundation. And it kind of starts with this sort of assertion that the relationship between data and the world, you can maybe call that its representational quality, is always going to be ambiguous, contentious, and political. And we have these sort of 4 different field studies. The first is Mediengruppe Bitnik, they're a tech artist couple, and they look at the concept of unreal data. So this is injecting fake data into existing large data infrastructures as a sort of disruptive tactic. There's what I summarize as the datafied self, but that's together with Cornelia Solfrank, who's a cyber feminist from Berlin. And it's looking at sort of the datafied body and ways to relate to that. Another field study is user practice, so that's about sort of different practices that users can, about sort of how we engage with our own data, with our own social media feeds and recommendation algorithms and different tactics we can employ there. And then there's sort of datafied nature, and it's a sort of similar idea to the datafied self or body. An artist who records lots of different data about like GPS data of migratory birds, things like that, and sort of maps out the kind of data infrastructures around that. So it's a broad project, and we have 2 transversal approaches. One is media theory, and the other is data science, and that's sort of where my role there. And the reason I really wanted to mention it is because my main activities, besides the dialogue and collaboration with each of the individual field studies, is that I have the space and time to kind of follow a whim and sort of try to work out a bit of an ethical framework for myself as a data scientist to try to then apply, for instance, in the bias project and other areas. And that's sort of, I'm trying to draw from feminist and eco-feminist thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir and Donna Haraway. And for now, I'm working with the title of the model cyborg and the ethics of ambiguity. But it all kind of plays together with this value-sensitive design and agnostic machine learning in the bias projects. And so, yeah, it's kind of this, a lot of different directions looking at the same kind of questions. So I hope that's...
Okay, so I'm a computer scientist and I'm not involved with any of your projects. I just asked Akis a little bit about this. So I haven't been here this morning, so I don't know what the discussion are about. But let's say we are on the dark side in the sense that we are generating data. So, so my area is really image and video generation. Well, we are using now, so one thing that I want to talk about, it's a thing that we've done recently, it's called open bias. So I wanted to go beyond, let's say, the obvious biases. Okay, well, so let's see how this works. Right, so, well, we know that if you have foundation models, we are generating biased data. And this is not necessarily bad, so we can discuss probably later a little bit that, in my opinion, having bias is not necessarily bad. I know that in general it's considered as a bad stuff, but it could also be, there are a few things that in which bias could also be positive. And actually what we try to do is to go beyond the closed domain type of bias. And how can we do that? Well, in many cases we don't even realize that it's biased, right? Also because maybe we are biased ourselves. Right? So what we want to do is to use foundation models to kind of tell us what kind of biases you can have given the data, and then we go and check it, and then we try to mitigate it. So in some cases, this is what I said, we can have unexpected biases. So you give an attribute agnostic prompt, right? So let's say you say, I want a picture of a doctor. What kind of images are going to be generated? And this is, we did exactly that. And well, this is a gender bias, and maybe it's just not a surprise, but in most of the cases it will generate men, right? Of course, as you see, the prompt it's kind of attribute agnostic, right? It could be just a doctor. If you say a doctor is, maybe it would be a woman, or if you want to say something else, if you had some other attributes, maybe you can change these type of things. So what we were working on is to try to extend the closed set type of bias to things in which you could get an open bias. So we try to propose a set of novel domain biases and try to investigate, and I will give you some examples, what sort of biases you can have when you generate the data. And then, why we need to generate data? Well, in many cases, the data is not available or is not labeled and so on, so we want to use it for data augmentation. So now, if we are generating bias data, of course, we are going to increase the bias. The more we train, the more bias is going to obtain. And this is like a pipeline, so practically you start from a real data set and of real textual captions. You just leverage a large language model to build a knowledge base. And then in the second stage, you are synthesizing images that are generating using the target model condition of the caption. And potential bias is identified. I will show you the next slide. And finally, the biases are assessed, quantified, and by acquiring a VQA model with caption-specific questions, extracting during the bias proposal phase. And these are some examples of biases. Some of them are kind of strange, like we said, a train zips down the railways in the sun, and for some reason the trains are all yellow. Why this is happening, we have no idea. Probably the data we had, I think yellow trains are in India, so probably there was a lot of data from India, and that's why we get all these yellow trains. Or a photo of a person on a laptop in a coffee shop. And for some reason, most of the laptops are just Apple laptops. Okay? This is probably obvious, but in some cases it may not be. I like the other one, so a small child hurrying towards a bus on a dirt road. And then what we obtain in there, and this is just using a standard diffusion model, we obtain a black child. And then what we are doing at the moment is trying to understand which one of those words are creating this bias. Okay, maybe an obvious stuff will be maybe the dirt road. So now if you put a paved road or just on a road, what's going to happen? We still see a little bit of bias, but definitely if you associate dirt roads, probably in rural Africa you have many dirt roads, and that's why you get all these biases. Okay, so that's more or less what I wanted to tell you, and then, well, we are open for discussions.
Thank you all very much for nice introductions, and I would directly like to follow up on something what Nicu said. So you said bias doesn't have to be a good thing, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, which I agree, because I think it always gives you actionable data. My background is in medicine, so seeing bias will mean you need to do something about it. There is a disease which is biased in a way. Why is it? Now I wonder what would be your most prominent, easy example where you would say bias is not bad.
Well, I mean, I think it's the first thing is maybe you discussed, guys, this morning in what's the definition of bias. So to me, for example, a cultural bias is not necessarily bad, right? So I may, let's say, because I belong to that particular family or to that particular society and so on, and I believe in that particular tradition, this will definitely be a bias. If you want to go also, for example, personal preferences are biases, right? So I like, I don't know, oranges and not apples for some reasons. It is a bias, and it's not necessarily bad. So in this respect, I mean. Of course, when we generate data, we need to make sure that we are creating diversity, because I think this is quite important. Otherwise, bias in this respect, if you look into it, there will be a data set bias, in the sense the data set is not diverse enough, so then you are just generating one type of data. But then, of course, when you look into bias, it's not only the bias in the data set that we have, but in the world there are real biases. You know, most of the soldiers, for example, are men, for some good reasons. Most of the, I don't know, other kind of, for example, another type of bias, if you put a person in a kitchen, you get a lot of females, for example. Okay, even though it's not necessarily true, because most of the cooks will be men. So there are all these kind of things that we can discover for sure.
Hi. May I have another question about bias? Thank you. I mean, I totally agree that bias is not necessarily a negative thing, and I think bias is what we use actually to steer the algorithm in a certain direction, right? So you bias the algorithms in order to be able to do the induction, for example, right? But I think the problem here is that we don't really know in which direction to bias somehow, or do you have a good understanding how to bias the algorithm to perform well, be unfair, and so on and so forth? How should we bias the algorithm? I think we need to bias them to learn something, but in which direction? How can we bias them?
Well, let me ask first, and then I can answer that my colleagues. So, well, one of the main issues with bias detection, mitigation, and so on is to create a good measure. How do you measure indeed that you have a bias, and then when you are mitigating it, how do you tell that indeed you are going to the right direction? So, let's say in an easy way, assuming that you have a large data set, practically what we do, we try to kind of balance it. Well, this is, of course, you have validation set, and you can do it on that. Then in real world, it's not necessarily true, and it's not. But I think it's also depending on the scope you want to do with, right? If it's if you have some good measure, if you want to create diversity, if you want to get, I don't know, gender balance or so, in that case, you can have a measure and you can just generate it over and over again until you obtain this particular, let's say, direction convergence.
I wanted to point out two things. The first one is that the problem with predictive, using biases with predictive behaviors in AI, that's why it's so harmful, because you're using the biases. The biases lead to discrimination, for instance. Going beyond also the symbolic you were thinking about, but there is also practical consequences. I mean, people are not getting loans because of their features, or many other, you know, bailout for prison, many topics, more and more. So that's where I can understand theoretically what you're speaking about, but there are many practical consequences. We should, I mean, ideally from a political point of view, stop right now, because people are really harmed by it. You know, lives are impacted. And the second thing I would like to talk about the biases is that unless you involve the users, you will never be sure of how many biases and harms you are creating. Because, for instance, as I said before, I'm a white woman. I cannot even understand what other type of women, for example, or other people from LGBT communities, how they experience what harms. Because I cannot be harmed, but another woman can be, and I don't know it about. So it cannot be based only on a certain type of view. It's not how we can say, sort of like a list that can be closed, I guess. I mean, you should open the process and allow users all the time to be involved, get feedbacks, involve them in the designing process. So in this way you can always keep checking, because society is evolving and we need to evolve and keep open the process as well. Otherwise, we cannot just stop. Okay, now it's fair. It can be fair today, but tomorrow can start to be unfair again.
I guess I can also say something about this question of how do we steer bias or shift bias if we are choosing to do that. And yeah, I mean, of course we can do things like rebalancing our data sets, and we can come up with metrics and try to optimize for different metrics according to whatever idea of fairness we're trying to encode in that metric. And we can put it in our loss function if we want. We can put it in some reinforcement learning reward function. There's lots of different things, but another point to me is kind of like, first of all, there's always going to be some gap between, a metric is a proxy for something very, very complicated, and it's never going to be fully aligned. Optimizing for metric is never going to be fully aligned for whatever value we're trying to encode in that metric, and we always have to be aware of that. And I just like the general idea of trying to think about what worldview is encoded in this model. If it's an image generating model, it has some, say, latent space, there's some view of the world encoded in that model. And we have some power to influence that, but also it's incomplete. But I think somehow this question is really fundamental when it comes to at every step, when we put a model into the world, that worldview is being reinforced, whether it's the fact that it views gender as a binary or something really complicated that we don't really understand. And I think so, it's not just metrics. We really have to think about what the model's reinforcing, and that's a very deep, complicated question.
Hi. Actually, I have one question. Before that, I want to mention that, you said that, bias can be good, or it depends. But actually, the main point here is it depends. It depends on the context, and probably this has been mentioned many times today. And that's the reason why, maybe it's actually alarming to see that only black kids or child are actually running in dirt. So this tells us about the world that we need to work on that. So this is good in a sense that it gives us some sort of a reality check. We need to work on that. But at the same time, for example, say in a context, if it is used for hiring, I don't want to get a higher probability because I'm a male, or maybe I don't want to get a lower probability. Okay, my surname is English, but let's say some other for which it identifies me as a brown. So I don't want to get also disarmed by that. So in that case, we make some sort of let's say debiasing. Sorry to use the word again. So debiasing measures to somehow let's say in the latent space itself, because latent space has been mentioned twice in this. So let's say in the word embedding space or in the image embedding space, we made some corrections, but we don't know what the side effects of those corrections were. So I probably think that don't you think the side effects has to be taken into account while making such corrections, where you shift, say, for example, say you're trying to shift a gender neutral or let's say like not a very biased word of a doctor to a general neutrality sort of like an axis, but while doing so, you are creating maybe like more problems or more bias.
No, I agree. Of course, it should be application dependent. Also, you have to look at the consumers. I completely agree, of course. But if you think about it, all the technology that we are developing, it has exactly the same problem, right? So we are doing, I don't know, I'm a computer vision guy, we are doing tracking. I should stop tracking because they are going to use tracking into, I don't know, for war, for other things. Maybe not, because tracking also is useful for something else. So, yes, indeed, I mean, maybe it's a problem, and that's why, I mean, we have people from other disciplines in here, that we as a technologists, we try to be, you know, kind of agnostic. So we are developing technology for the sake of it, and we try to make it nice, and we try to provide measures and so on. But indeed, it can be also used into in a bad way. So I agree. I mean, you can, if you do all these type of things, you could create other biases that you are not aware of. Just to address, you know, what you said at the beginning, that indeed, if you have an interview, for example, you could induce some bias and so on. So one work that we've been working recently also was kind of doing anonymization. So practically what we want to do also in the latent space, so it's kind of, you have an interview, it is your face, but it's not you. So we are keeping, let's say, your characteristics, let's say in my case, white hair and other kind of things, but it's not me. So again, you try to take away the identity, or maybe some of the attributes that you want to let's say, could be harmful for bias, but you still preserve, let's say, your personal, let's say, way of talking, or your personal attributes, or some other kind of things. So you could play around with this type of thing. But of course, you can do it only and only if you know who is going to be the consumer, what is the application, and so on. Because in general, you cannot just solve a problem just by putting some metrics or so. I mean, you really need to know what you are using it for.
Very quickly, I think that the challenge is to abandon the idea of having one solution fits all. Let's say you have to be gender neutral, or you have to be, for example, gender neutral, because just to make a quick example, for, let's say, hiring process, gender neutral can be useful because there are many biases in certain kind of jobs for women, but if we're talking about healthcare, people need to know that there are different reactions to a female body, or a trans person body is completely different, so they need to really look at the gender of the person. So that's why it's so difficult, it's challenging, because it's not one fits all, but it's every context, every topic requires a specific approach.
Hi, okay. I have two questions, I'll just do one next to the other, so then, so my first question is to Giulia. Do you believe that like data altruism from the Data Governance Act, that is like fostering data donation for social good, and like fostering this data reuse, can support like civil society to use better or improve data collection and data reuse in the case of intersectionality and diversity? Because we can see like governments, they have loads of data, but they're not necessarily collected the right way or the best way to improve societal issues. This is the first question.
Can you just repeat the beginning of the question?
Yes, so data altruism from the Data Governance Act.
Okay.
Because I know that UI Act and the DSA is getting all the publicity, but we also have the Data Governance Act. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then the second question would be to, sorry for my pronunciation, Alexandre?
Alex is fine.
Alex, thank you. You mentioned the value-sensitive design. I assume that is from Professor Jerome van der Hoeven. And and also talk about like intersectionality. So how would you can combine like a feminist and intersectional perspective within the value-sensitive design process? Thank you.
Okay. So I mean, in a sense, the more data we have, the better. Because I mean, looking directly at what institutions' data, I mean, they are not so much actually. Because sometimes institutions ask companies, you know, to gather, think about, let's say, mobility or other kind of issues. So the institution make contracts with private companies to gather information, but sometimes they don't write down in the contract that the property of data has to be public, and they have to give immediately, automatically, all the data necessary to make good public policies and good policy decisions. So what I've seen firsthand, that's a problem, at least in Italy I've seen it directly. So sharing data would be definitely, the more we share, the better, obviously respecting privacy, GDPR and so on and so forth. But it also depends on also which kind of data. I mean, where are you gathering the data, how they gather it, because they can still gather it, for instance, in a binary way. To make an example about gender, I mean, still not very common to have, an open gender gathering of data. So they may gather many data, but they are just binary, for example, or they don't necessarily put the background from maybe ethnicity that can be useful for understanding certain dynamics of discriminations. So I mean, it really depends on how the data set is made. I think it's important to talk about it, data altruism, but it doesn't solve the issues of how many data are still owned by the private companies. They very unlikely apply to the data altruism. But still, I mean, it's important because there can be, for instance, many big no-profit organizations that do a lot of work for social welfare and other kind of activities that need to share data combined with the institutional data to have a better understanding of certain phenomena. So this is good, but it's not enough to achieve still, a proper intersectional approach to data, because it's still very difficult to even, grasp intersectional approach way even in real life. Are we intersectional in audiences, in panels? I mean, we can apply this to everything, and there's still so much to do in every aspect of it. So that's why it's so complex and difficult.
Yeah, the question about bringing sort of feminist thinking into value-sensitive design is hard. I don't really have like a super concise answer to that. Maybe you also have some comments, but I guess there's a couple ways that I think about, at least. So, okay, well, I didn't expect to be asked this question, but one of the sort of main principles of value-sensitive design is this idea that society and technology are mutually constitutive, that they sort of shape each other. And this is quite sort of in line with de Beauvoir's thinking about sort of what she calls eminence and transcendence or whatever, but like the sort of duality of being both restricted by sort of all the different social norms and whatever else, outside forces around us, but also having some degree of freedom of choice. And this is somehow, when I said that thing about like, how are we shaping the model's worldview and its own sort of freedom of choice versus the sort of restrictions it's inheriting from various outside things. That's kind of a leap that I made personally. But it also kind of means, well, when we collect people's data, we can reduce them to their data, and that's a sort of form of objectification to me. And so when trying to sort of bring in value-sensitive design and try to think of a different way to build tools, it's a little bit this one idea, this sort of, I guess you could call it a feminist idea, but it's not just a feminist idea, of not objectifying and trying to sort of respect the subjectivity and agency of everyone that's affected by the whatever AI tool you're talking about, including the people on the design side and the people using the tool and the people affected by whatever. Yeah, and there's I can go for a long time on, but that's sort of one way to answer the question, I guess. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on the value-sensitive design question. value-sensitive design has received a lot of criticism, of course. So we have right now, like Di Salvo, Laura Forlano, that are working right now on speculative design, so it's something different. But why value-sensitive design has received so many criticisms? Because of course, you can imagine, okay, value-sensitive design is an iterative process, so you have a conceptual activity, then an empirical activity, then a technical one. In the empirical activity, you have to measure values, okay? So, but how to distinguish values from mere preferences? So we had, in the past years, in the last 5 years or more, normative approach to value-sensitive design. They're trying to implement car-sensitive design, for example, also design for SDGs, another way of operationalizing AI for good. But again, maybe not from the bottom up. So it's like, yeah, top down, yeah. And now they're trying, Ibo and all the others from Delft, so even Jeroen from Delft, they're trying to implement modalities in the empirical phase. So how to measure value, no? They are difficult to define in the conceptual phase, but they're also difficult to measure and let alone predict people. So the main goal right now for value-sensitive design project for me is like, again, the social alignment work. That means trying to be really iterative in their processes. So trying to have an empirical phase that can lead always to redesign. So always to iterative way and include multi-stakeholder partnership for sure. So they're also trying to work right now with the municipality in Amsterdam. So just to give an example, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to note that I'm very happy to see so much feminism coming into this debate, and yeah, it's really great to see, or once you experience this whole jargon that is already out there, that you can just dive into, that is very well written, very poetic and very fits our problems really, really well. So I really encourage everyone to get yourself into these intersectional feminist cyber movement from the 90s up until now. There's a lot of great work being done, and thank you very much for bringing that on these sorts of spaces in a very male-dominated area. So I'm just very happy to see that, first of all. And something that was more on my mind recently was that I saw a lot when I read about bias anywhere, even when coming from civic society perspectives, they say AI can exacerbate bias, or it might amplify our social inequalities. So there is a lot of these if words being placed in the discourse, and I was actually wondering, why are we still doing that? Because I think that if you're coming from the I understand that OpenAI doesn't want to say that they are inherently biased, but maybe we as a field should say, wait a minute, AI exacerbates bias, or it exacerbates or amplifies inequalities. So would you agree on the fact that it might be a good idea for us to skip the ambiguity around whether or not these systems are unfair?
Well, I mean, we like it or not, we are living in a biased world. I mean, with AI or without AI, I don't think that this is really necessarily bad. And I agree, AI may exacerbate the bias and may amplify it, but on the other hand, I think AI also has a potential to mitigate the bias in many ways, in the sense that it's the availability of technology could also, also to let's say third world countries and so on, could also help them, also in education and also in other kind of things. So I don't think it's again, it depends on the context, depends on the of the application, depends on the user. So I think if we are doing it carefully, I don't think we need to be afraid of it. And OpenAI, you said, well, yes, OpenAI is biased, but it's also reflecting the bias that we have all over in the society. So I don't think it's necessarily bad. We may try to change the bias, we may try to change our society, and we are doing it. I mean, it's definitely much better now than it used to be 100 years ago.
I didn't really wonder if it was bad or not, just about whether or not it's always there. So I think
it will always be, because the world it is biased, as I said. I mean, it depends now at what sort of, how you define the bias. And I think it's in some sense, if we bias means also personalization in some way, it's not necessarily bad. So it is going always to be. Probably, also I was talking about the cultural aspects. So maybe, let's say, an Indian will always be biased versus an American in some way. But this is, again, it could be good as long as you are preserving the tradition, you are preserving some of the, again, the tradition. Could be maybe the masculine society in India, maybe it's more exacerbated than in US. This is bad. But other kind of things which could be positive, I don't know.
I mean, I do think that we get a little bit hung up on all the fears about AI, but I also think it's a huge uphill battle, yeah, exactly, because for obvious reasons, most of the uses of AI that exist, and probably for a long time this will be the case, reinforce existing power structures and inequalities. They require lots of money, they require lots of data, they require huge infrastructures, and it's mostly run by this Silicon Valley tech bro world, of course. And it's really hard to see how we can redistribute that power and try to make, but I do think, the important question is not like, I mean, okay, what harm can AI cause is an important question, but another important question is, what kind of AI do we want? And that goes along with the question of what kind of world do we want, right? So,
yeah, I mean, personally, I have no doubt that it's bad, but because of what you just said, I mean, the world is biased. What kind of world do we want? So we want a better world. So if we want a better world, we should work for a different kind of how the AI is working. But I mean, there are powers. I agree to say it's an instrument, so it depends on how you're going to use it. But we are seeing so many imbalances of control of power. We're talking about a handful of companies that control everything. So this makes me very skeptical, now that I'm almost 40, talking about personal issues, compared to when I was 20, in my 20s, that, about redistribution. I mean, in order to achieve that, to have this instrument be used for the good, we need a revolution of ourselves. I mean, that's simple. I mean, we need to reorganize our society, and so bring the instruments with this revolution for a better future, juster future with us. With all the other instruments, also besides AI, I mean, it's not just AI, but that's what we're talking about, completely shifting, because the power imbalances, economically, social, are just getting bigger and bigger every year. It's not decreasing if you look at the larger data. So we need to work very hard if we want to achieve this outcome. And I hope that more and more people will want to achieve it, because we will live better. Even if we are privileged, even if who has privilege, we'll see that if the world is going to, unfortunately, to fall down on many issues, that the privilege goes down as well. I mean, it regards everybody, even the ones that have privilege, to give it up a little bit and work for a better field goal for everyone. That's what I wish for.